When rural archaeologist Dr. Mason Caldwell discovered ancient agricultural manuscripts hidden in the walls of a crumbling 13th century barn, he never expected to uncover farming techniques that would increase modern crop yields by 70% without chemicals or genetic modification. A finding that would attract global attention, spark a bidding war among agricultural corporations, trigger federal investigations, and revolutionize how America thinks about sustainable agriculture's forgotten past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The chilled autumn air bit at Mason Caldwell's cheeks as he carefully extracted another weathered page from the hidden cavity in the stone wall. At 42, the archaeologist stood motionless amidst the ancient timber beams, his experienced hands trembling slightly as he realized what he was holding. These weren't just building records or parish accounts. These were detailed agricultural instructions, meticulously preserved for over 7 centuries. "This changes everything we thought we knew," Mason whispered to himself, examining the intricate diagrams showing crop rotation systems far more sophisticated than anything previously documented from medieval England. The pages depicted specialized companion planting techniques, soil preparation methods, and natural pest management systems that looked remarkably advanced even by modern standards. For 15 years, the Caldwell Foundation had specialized in documenting vanishing agricultural heritage sites across New England. Mason had left his prestigious position at Cornell University to establish the small non-profit, dedicating his career to preserving farming knowledge that was rapidly disappearing from America's rural landscape. The decision had cost him professionally, but the discovery in this abandoned barn on the outskirts of Millfield, Vermont, might vindicate his unconventional career path. The Garrett farm had stood empty for decades, the once proud homestead gradually reclaimed by nature until only the stone barn remained partially intact. When developers purchased the 180-acre property for a planned luxury home community, Mason's foundation had secured a last-minute survey permit before demolition began, standard practice for documenting historically significant agricultural structures before they disappeared forever. "Dr. Caldwell," called a voice from the doorway. Amy Spencer, Mason's 29-year-old research assistant, navigated carefully through the debris-strewn floor, her practical boots crunching on fallen roof tiles. 6 months earlier, she had deferred her doctoral program in agricultural history when funding cuts threatened the foundation's survival. Her expertise in medieval farming practices and fluency in Middle English had already proven invaluable to their small team. "They hit the 2-hour mark 10 minutes ago," she continued, referencing the construction crew waiting impatiently to begin demolition. "The foreman says we need to wrap it up." Mason barely heard her, still transfixed by what he'd found. "Amy, come look at this." He carefully laid the delicate parchment pages on his portable work table. "These aren't just random notes. This is a complete agricultural system, and nothing like what conventional history tells us about medieval farming." Amy's eyes widened as she scanned the pages. Her fingers hovered above the text, not daring to touch the fragile documents. "These planting configurations, they're using companion relationships we've only discovered in the last 50 years. She pointed to an intricate diagram. "And look at these soil amendment formulas. They're describing microbial enrichment processes that sound remarkably similar to modern biodynamic techniques." Mason nodded, his excitement building. "This isn't primitive agriculture, Amy. These people understood plant relationships, soil biology, and ecological balance at a level that was lost for centuries. And the preservation of these documents, it's almost as if someone deliberately hid them for future discovery." "The precision is remarkable," Amy observed, studying the illustrations. These aren't general guidelines. They're specific formulations, exact planting distances, precise timing protocols. Whoever created these understood agricultural science at a fundamental level. This contradicts everything we've been taught about medieval farming practices. The blaring horn of a bulldozer interrupted their examination. Through the crumbling doorway, Mason could see the construction supervisor gesturing impatiently. "We need more time," Mason said, his voice tight with urgency. "These documents could rewrite agricultural history." Amy glanced at her watch. "The developers won't extend our permit without significant incentive. Our grant barely covered this brief survey." Mason carefully gathered the fragile documents into their archival container. "Then we need to show them exactly what's at stake here. The historical significance alone should buy us a few more days." That evening, in the cramped office space that served as the Caldwell Foundation's headquarters, Mason and Amy worked methodically to document their extraordinary find. The small, converted farmhouse on the outskirts of town housed their modest operation, a stark contrast to the well-funded university labs Mason had left behind. "The Foundation's bank account has $4,873 remaining," Amy reported, reviewing their finances on her laptop. "Even if we redirect everything from the Wilkinson Mill documentation project, we're looking at barely enough to purchase a 2-week extension from Rexford Development." Mason rubbed his tired eyes as he carefully photographed each page of the manuscripts. "What about the Emergency Preservation Fund?" "Already factored in," Amy replied grimly. "And we're still awaiting reimbursement for the Lancaster Silo survey. We're operating on fumes, Mason." The financial reality was stark. After years of declining grants and increasing competition for heritage preservation dollars, the Caldwell Foundation was on the verge of collapse. Mason had been covering operating costs from his personal savings for months, a resource that was rapidly approaching depletion. "There's something else," Amy said hesitantly. "I've been translating more of the text, and these aren't just historical techniques. The formulations describe methods for dramatically increasing crop yields while simultaneously improving soil health. If these processes work as described, they could be agriculturally significant today." Mason stopped his cataloguing. The implications, suddenly clear. "Commercially valuable, potentially revolutionary," Amy corrected. "This section describes a soil amendment process that, if I'm translating correctly, claims to increase wheat yields by nearly 70% while reducing water requirements by a third, all using entirely natural inputs available in the medieval period." Mason stared at the ancient pages, the weight of responsibility suddenly overwhelming. "This changes our approach entirely. We're no longer just preserving history. These manuscripts might contain solutions to current agricultural challenges, sustainable food production methods that were developed centuries ago and then lost to time." "So what's our next move?" Amy asked, sensing the shift in Mason's thinking. "We need to verify if these techniques actually work," Mason replied, formulating a plan. "We have enough details from these initial documents to test some of the basic principles. If the results are even partially as effective as described, we'll have leverage to protect the site and continue our research." "The university has controlled growth facilities," Amy suggested. "I still have access through my doctoral program. We could run preliminary trials without attracting attention." Mason nodded, but caution tempered his excitement. "We need to be strategic about this. If these techniques prove commercially valuable, we'll immediately face ethical questions about how this knowledge should be shared or protected." Amy's expression hardened as she considered the broader implications. Rexford Development isn't just building luxury homes. Their parent company, Meridian Agricultural Holdings, controls massive farming operations throughout the Midwest. If they realized what we found on property they already own, they'd either bury it or exploit it exclusively, Mason finished. Neither outcome serves the public good or honors the knowledge that someone carefully preserved for centuries. The dilemma was profound. As preservationists, their mission was to document and share agricultural heritage. But this discovery transcended simple historical documentation. These weren't just artifacts of past practices. They potentially represented solutions to pressing contemporary challenges in sustainable food production. We have 72 hours before the demolition permit activates, Mason said finally, making his decision. Let's determine if these techniques actually work before we decide how to proceed. Knowledge this important deserves careful stewardship. As the night deepened, Mason and Amy continued their careful documentation, unaware that their discovery would soon attract attention far beyond academic circles. The ancient farming techniques, hidden for centuries in a crumbling Vermont barn, were about to become the center of a modern conflict involving corporate agriculture, federal authorities, and global food security interests. What began as a routine historical documentation project would ultimately expose how modern agricultural systems had abandoned effective sustainable practices in favor of chemical-dependent approaches that benefited corporate profits while depleting soil and threatening long-term food security. A revelation that would not only save the Caldwell Foundation, but fundamentally challenge how America and the world approached the growing crisis in sustainable agriculture. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days after their initial discovery, Mason and Amy worked with silent intensity in a small research greenhouse at the university's agricultural extension facility. Thanks to Amy's connections, they had secured after-hours access to the controlled environment chambers normally reserved for graduate research projects. "Are you sure about these proportions?" Mason asked, carefully measuring crushed minerals according to the medieval manuscript's specifications. The mixture looked ordinary. Volcanic ash, pulverized shells, and several plant extracts, but the precise ratios were unlike anything in modern agricultural literature. "The manuscript is explicit," Amy confirmed, cross-referencing her translation. Notes: this soil amendment was applied during the waning moon in early spring, with specific fermentation periods before application. She adjusted her safety goggles, still amazed they were attempting to recreate an 800-year-old agricultural formula. Their experiment was necessarily modest. 20 controlled planters with identical wheat seedlings, half treated according to the manuscript's instructions, half following modern organic growing protocols. It wasn't comprehensive research, but it might provide preliminary evidence of the technique's efficacy. "Dr. Caldwell, is that you?" came an unexpected voice from the greenhouse entrance. Mason turned to see Dr. Rebecca Turner, chair of the Agricultural Sciences Department, standing in the doorway with evident surprise. "I didn't realize you had university clearance to use these facilities." Mason straightened, attempting to appear casual, despite the unusual hour and unauthorized experiment. "Rebecca, good to see you." Amy arranged temporary access for a small heritage project we're documenting. Dr. Turner approached with professional curiosity, examining their setup. "Interesting arrangement. What exactly are you testing?" Her practiced eye scanned the carefully labeled containers and unusual mixture. "Historical farming methods," Amy interjected quickly, "for comparative documentation purposes." Rebecca picked up one of their reference photos, studying the medieval diagrams with growing interest. "These configurations look remarkably sophisticated. Where did these come from?" Mason hesitated, weighing his response carefully. Rebecca had been a colleague before his departure from academia, but institutional obligations would require her to report commercially significant research conducted in university facilities. "A recent archival discovery," he answered truthfully, but vaguely. We're assessing their historical accuracy before completing our documentation. Rebecca's expression suggested professional skepticism. Mason, I know budget cuts have hit independent researchers hard, but using university facilities for undisclosed commercial research would violate multiple policies. It's strictly historical verification, Mason insisted, though the tension in his voice betrayed his discomfort with the half-truth. Then you won't mind if I observe your results, Rebecca replied with pointed emphasis. The department is always interested in historically validated sustainable techniques. She placed the photograph down deliberately, especially ones that appear this sophisticated. After Rebecca departed with a promise to check on their progress, Amy expelled a breath she'd been holding. That was close. She suspects we're onto something valuable. Rebecca's brilliant, Mason acknowledged. One look at these configurations, and she recognized their potential significance. He carefully sealed their containers of prepared amendment. We need to accelerate our timeline. Rexford Development's demolition permit activates tomorrow, and we've just attracted exactly the kind of attention we were hoping to avoid. That night, they completed the experimental setup, carefully documenting each step, according to both the medieval instructions and contemporary scientific protocols. If the results proved promising, they would need impeccable documentation to verify their findings. I've been researching Meridian Agricultural Holdings, Amy said as they secured the greenhouse. Their corporate structure is fascinating. They've systematically acquired smaller agricultural technology companies over the past decade, particularly those developing sustainable methods that might reduce dependence on their chemical product lines. Consolidation to control innovation, Mason observed. Standard corporate strategy. What's not standard is their connection to the Millfield Heritage Committee, Amy continued. 3 members also sit on Meridian's Regional Advisory Board. If we approach the Committee for Emergency Heritage Protection for the barn, we'd be telegraphing our discovery directly to Meridian, Mason concluded. We need to establish scientific verification before we reveal what we've found. The following morning brought both promise and complication. Mason arrived at the Foundation office to find Logan Walsh, the Rexford Development Project Manager, waiting at the door. The tall, impeccably dressed executive didn't bother with pleasantries. Dr. Caldwell, your survey permit expired at midnight. Our demolition team is scheduled to begin work this afternoon, Walsh stated flatly, unless you've discovered something of extraordinary historical significance. His tone suggested the question was merely procedural. We're still completing our documentation, Mason replied carefully. The structural elements show unusual architectural features that warrant additional study. Walsh's expression remained impassive. Our historical compliance assessment was comprehensive. The local heritage committee already determined the site contains no elements requiring preservation. Perhaps they missed something, Mason suggested. We found evidence of unique construction techniques. I'm sure you have, Walsh replied, with subtle condescension. Nevertheless, our schedule proceeds as planned unless you can provide compelling legal grounds for delay. He handed Mason a business card. My direct line, should you discover anything truly significant before 2 p.m. As Walsh departed, Mason's phone chimed with a message from Amy. Greenhouse ASAP. You need to see this. 20 minutes later, Mason stood speechless in the university greenhouse. Just 4 days after application, the difference between the treatment groups was already visible. The seedlings exposed to the medieval soil amendment stood nearly 30% taller than the control group, with noticeably richer color and thicker stems. It's statistically impossible, Amy whispered, handing him the measurement data. Growth acceleration of this magnitude shouldn't happen with organic amendments. Even synthetic growth promoters don't work this fast. Mason carefully examined the developing plants, professional skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. Could there be contamination? Equipment malfunction? I've run 3 verification checks, Amy confirmed. The results are consistent across all test groups. Whatever this medieval formula is, it's dramatically accelerating nutrient uptake and cellular development without genetic modification or synthetic chemicals. Mason photographed the results from multiple angles, documenting the remarkable difference. We need to secure the site immediately. If these early results hold, what we've found could transform sustainable agriculture. Rexford breaks ground in 4 hours, Amy reminded him, and we still have only a fraction of the complete manuscript. The remaining documents are still hidden in that barn. Mason stared at the thriving seedlings, making his decision. Call. Dr. Turner, we need institutional support now. That means academic disclosure, Amy warned. The university will claim interest in anything developed using their facilities. We don't have a choice, Mason replied. The barn will be rubble by sunset unless we leverage every resource available. These techniques are too important to lose. An hour later, Mason sat across from a university attorney and Dr. Turner in the administration building. The preliminary photographs of their experiment had generated immediate interest, triggering the institution's protocols for potentially valuable research discoveries. To be clear, Dr. Caldwell, the University Council began, you conducted unauthorized research, using university facilities to test agricultural techniques discovered on private property currently slated for demolition. We were verifying historical accuracy, Mason corrected, of agricultural methods documented in manuscripts recovered during an approved archaeological survey. Dr. Turner interjected, the preliminary results are remarkable, regardless of the authorization issue. If verified, these techniques could represent a significant advancement in sustainable agriculture. The university's position, the attorney continued, is that any intellectual property developed using institutional resources falls under our research guidelines. Before we consider intervention with Rexford Development, we would need an agreement regarding ownership of any resulting patents or processes. Mason felt the trap closing. The very institutional dynamics that had driven him from academia were now threatening the recovery of knowledge that had survived 8 centuries only to be caught in modern proprietary battles. These techniques aren't modern inventions to be patented, he argued. They're historical knowledge that was preserved for generations. They belong to our agricultural heritage, not to corporate or institutional ownership. Admirable sentiment, the attorney noted without enthusiasm, but legally irrelevant to our current situation. Without a formal agreement, the university cannot intervene. Mason glanced at his watch, barely 2 hours remaining before demolition began. The institutional pathway was closing, exactly as he had feared. He gathered his documentation and stood to leave. Where are you going? Dr. Turner asked, surprised by his abrupt departure. To find another way to protect this knowledge, Mason replied. What he didn't share was the backup plan they had prepared, one that would either save the historical treasure or place him directly in the crosshairs of powerful agricultural interests whose profits depended on keeping such sustainable alternatives firmly in the past. As he exited the administration building, Amy was waiting with her car running. Plan B? She asked, already knowing the answer. Mason nodded grimly. Plan B, we're out of institutional options. What neither of them realized as they rushed toward the endangered site was that news of their discovery had already begun spreading through channels they hadn't anticipated, attracting attention from entities far more powerful than local developers or university administrators. Plan B was riskier than anything Mason had attempted in his academic career. As Amy drove toward the Garrett farm site, Mason made a call he'd been avoiding to journalist Ellie Donovan at the National Science Monitor. A former student of his at Cornell, Ellie had built her reputation on stories at the intersection of science, history, and corporate interests. "Dr. Caldwell," she answered, surprise evident in her voice. "It's been years. What can I do for my favorite professor?" "I need media coverage immediately," Mason replied, foregoing pleasantries. "We've discovered medieval agricultural manuscripts that may revolutionize sustainable farming, and they're about to be bulldozed." There was a momentary pause. "That's quite an opener, Dr. Caldwell. You have evidence to back this up?" "Preliminary growth trials showing 30% acceleration in just 4 days, using completely organic methods from the 13th century. I'm sending photos now." Mason attached the greenhouse images to a text message. "The site is scheduled for demolition at 2 p.m. today. If media attention doesn't stop it, these techniques could be lost forever." "This is short notice even for breaking news," Ellie replied, though Mason could hear her typing rapidly in the background. "Where exactly is this happening?" "Millfield, Vermont. The old Garrett Farm property. We have documentation permits, but they've expired. The developer is a subsidiary of Meridian Agricultural Holdings." The typing stopped abruptly. "Meridian, the same company that buried the sustainable irrigation study last year. That adds another dimension." "Can you help?" Mason pressed, watching the rural landscape give way to Millfield's modest outskirts. "I'm dispatching our Burlington stringer immediately, but physical presence will take at least an hour," Ellie replied. "In the meantime, I need you to record everything. Live stream if possible. Public visibility is your best protection right now." As they crested the hill overlooking the Garrett property, Mason's heart sank. 2 bulldozers and a demolition crew were already positioned near the barn, preparing for the scheduled destruction. A Rexford development truck was parked nearby, with Logan Walsh visible in conversation with the construction foreman. "They're starting early," Amy noted grimly, pulling onto the access road, "probably to avoid exactly what we're planning." Mason checked his watch, 12:45 p.m., more than an hour ahead of the announced schedule. He immediately began recording video on his phone as they approached the site. "Mr. Walsh," Mason called out as they parked, "your demolition permit isn't active until 2 p.m. You're proceeding illegally." The developer turned with rehearsed composure. "Dr. Caldwell, our schedule was adjusted due to weather concerns." He gestured toward clouds gathering on the horizon. "The permit office approved the change this morning." "Convenient timing," Amy muttered. Mason continued recording as he approached the barn. "We've discovered historically significant artifacts that qualify for emergency preservation. We're requesting an immediate halt to demolition pending review." Walsh's expression remained professionally neutral, though a tightness around his eyes betrayed irritation. "Unless you have a court order or intervention from the Heritage Committee, our work proceeds as planned. We have evidence of commercially valuable agricultural techniques preserved in this structure," Mason stated clearly, ensuring his recording captured the exchange. "Techniques already verified in controlled trials at the university. That got Walsh's full attention. Commercially valuable in what sense exactly?" "Sustainable farming methods that significantly outperform modern organic techniques," Mason replied, watching the calculation behind Walsh's eyes. "Methods that might interest Meridian's agricultural division, given their recent acquisitions in the sustainable farming sector." Walsh stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Dr. Caldwell. If your findings have potential commercial applications, Rexford would be interested in a cooperative arrangement." "Not interested in private arrangements," Mason replied, continuing to record, "This knowledge shouldn't be controlled by a single corporation. It belongs in the public domain." Walsh's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "You're making a significant miscalculation. Meridian has resources to properly develop and distribute valuable agricultural innovations. Independent researchers like yourself lack the infrastructure to bring such discoveries to market effectively." We're not looking to bring it to market, Amy interjected. These techniques should be freely available to farmers everywhere. Walsh checked his watch with deliberate emphasis. I can delay demolition for 30 minutes to discuss reasonable terms. Otherwise, we proceed immediately. He nodded toward the demolition crew, who had moved into position around the barn's perimeter. Mason faced an impossible dilemma. 30 minutes wasn't enough time for media presence or legal intervention, but every minute gained meant more opportunity to document the remaining manuscripts still hidden within the barn's walls. We'll use the 30 minutes to remove additional historical artifacts, Mason countered, with your crew as witnesses. Walsh considered briefly, then nodded. Supervised access only. My team will observe any removals. As Mason and Amy entered the barn under the watchful eyes of Walsh and 2 construction workers, Amy whispered, "This is a trap. Once they see exactly what we've found and where it's located, they'll never let us share it." "We don't need to remove everything," Mason replied quietly. "We just need to document enough to prove what exists. Ellie Stringer will be here within the hour. We need visible evidence to create public interest." They moved directly to the wall section, where they'd found the initial manuscripts, now partly exposed from their previous work. Mason positioned his phone to continuously record, while Amy carefully extracted additional pages from the hidden cavity. "These are incredible," she whispered, scanning the newly revealed documents. "This section details water conservation techniques that allow crops to thrive with minimal irrigation." She carefully photographed each page before placing it in their preservation folder. One of the construction workers moved closer, clearly reporting their activities through his radio to someone outside. Mason noticed Walsh engaged in an intense phone conversation, gesturing emphatically toward the barn. "We're running out of time," Mason warned. "Focus on the most complete sections." Amy nodded, working methodically despite the pressure. "There's more behind this stone," she noted, feeling a draft from behind a loose section of wall. "The cavity extends further than we thought." As she carefully removed the stone facing, both gasped at what was revealed. Not just additional pages, but a complete bound volume, remarkably preserved in what appeared to be an oiled leather casing. The medieval farmers hadn't just hidden individual techniques. They had concealed an entire agricultural treatise. "This is unprecedented," Mason breathed, carefully lifting the bound manuscript. "A complete agricultural handbook from the 13th century, deliberately preserved for future discovery." The construction worker immediately spoke into his radio, and seconds later, Walsh appeared at the barn entrance. His expression shifted from professional control to naked interest as he saw the bound volume in Mason's hands. "That object falls under our property ownership," Walsh stated flatly. "You'll need to surrender it immediately." "This is a historically significant artifact recovered under our valid archaeological survey permit," Mason countered, continuing to record. "We're entitled to document it properly before determining appropriate preservation." Walsh's phone rang, and after a brief conversation, his approach shifted noticeably. "Dr. Caldwell, Meridian's Chief Innovation Officer, would like to speak with you directly about a potential research partnership. We're prepared to offer significant funding to continue your work with these manuscripts, under proper controlled conditions, of course." "By controlled conditions, you mean Meridian ownership," Amy translated, carefully securing the additional documents they'd recovered. Walsh smiled thinly. "Valuable innovations require proper protection and development. Meridian can provide resources far beyond what your small foundation could access." Outside, the rumble of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the barn's crumbling doorway, Mason could see 3 unmarked SUVs approaching rapidly up the access road. The vehicles parked in a practiced formation, and several individuals in professional attire emerged. Looks like your media contact arrived more quickly than anticipated, Walsh observed, though his expression suggested he expected different visitors. As Mason and Amy exited the barn with their documented findings, they were met not by journalists, but by federal agents, credentials already displayed. The lead agent, a composed woman in her early 50s, approached directly. "Dr. Mason Caldwell, I'm Special Agent Victoria Hargrove, FBI Agricultural Crimes Unit. We need to speak with you regarding potentially stolen agricultural intellectual property and violation of the National Agricultural Security Act." Mason stared in confusion. "There must be some mistake. These are historical manuscripts we've legally documented under an archaeological survey permit." "The situation is more complicated than you realize, Dr. Caldwell," Agent Hargrove replied. "Those manuscripts may contain protected agricultural technologies reported stolen from Meridian research facilities last year." Behind the agent, Mason noticed Walsh's satisfied expression. The trap had closed, not through physical force, but through the intricate legal framework that increasingly treated agricultural knowledge as proprietary technology rather than human heritage. What Mason Caldwell couldn't know as federal agents secured the site was that his discovery had triggered alerts in monitoring systems far beyond local developers or university administrators. The ancient farming techniques preserved in that Vermont barn had unwittingly become the center of a complex battle over who controls the future of food production and who owns the sustainable agricultural knowledge of our past. The conference room at the Millfield Sheriff's Department was never designed for high-profile federal cases. Under harsh fluorescent lighting, Mason and Amy sat across from Agent Hargrove and her team, the seized manuscripts carefully arranged in evidence containers on the table between them. "Let me understand this correctly," Mason said, struggling to maintain his composure. "Meridian Agricultural Holdings is claiming these 13th century farming techniques were stolen from their research facilities? That's historically impossible." Agent Hargrove maintained her professional demeanor. "The claim is more nuanced than that, Dr. Caldwell. Meridian alleges that research materials documenting similar sustainable farming methods were stolen from their Vermont Innovation Center last year. When they became aware of your discovery and its apparent efficacy, they identified potential similarities that triggered federal involvement." "That's absurd," Amy protested. "These manuscripts are clearly medieval in origin. The parchment, the ink composition, the linguistic patterns, everything dates them to the 13th century. Meridian is making a false claim to seize historically significant artifacts. Carbon dating and materials analysis will resolve age discrepancies," Agent Hargrove acknowledged. "Our forensic team is already processing samples. However, the legal question extends beyond physical age to intellectual property considerations. How can 800-year-old farming techniques be considered intellectual property?" Mason demanded. A new voice joined the conversation as the conference room door opened. "Because Meridian filed patents on remarkably similar methods 3 years ago." The speaker was a man in his early 60s, with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to careful analysis. "Dr. Thomas Harrington, FBI Science Division," he introduced himself, placing a folder on the table. "We've been investigating agricultural biopiracy cases for the past decade." He spread several documents before Mason and Amy. Patent applications filed by Meridian subsidiary companies for novel organic growth acceleration methods and historic-inspired sustainable farming techniques. These patent applications describe methods strikingly similar to what we're seeing in your medieval manuscripts, Harrington explained, except Meridian claims they developed these techniques through modern research rather than historical recovery. Mason studied the documents with growing alarm. The technical descriptions matched many aspects of the medieval manuscripts, though wrapped in contemporary scientific terminology. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Either Meridian somehow accessed these same manuscripts before us, or they're attempting to patent techniques they discovered elsewhere and obscure their historical origins," Amy finished. "By claiming modern development, they avoid the prior art restrictions that would prevent patenting historical methods." Agent Hargrove nodded. "That's one possibility we're investigating, which raises questions about how you discovered these specific manuscripts in this specific location. We were conducting a legitimate archaeological survey before the barn's scheduled demolition," Mason explained for the third time. "The manuscripts were hidden within a wall cavity, deliberately preserved. We have documentation of the entire discovery process." "Remarkably convenient timing," Harrington noted, "discovering centuries-old techniques just as Meridian's patent applications enter final review stages." "Are we suspects or witnesses?" Amy asked directly. "That depends on what our investigation reveals," Agent Hargrove replied. "The Agricultural Security Act treats proprietary farming technologies as protected national security assets. If these manuscripts contain modernized versions of historical techniques designed to circumvent Meridian's patents, that would constitute industrial espionage. And if they're genuine medieval documents that Meridian is attempting to claim as their own modern innovation," Mason countered, "that would raise different legal questions," Hargrove acknowledged. "Either way, these manuscripts remain in federal custody until provenance is established." As Mason prepared to protest, his phone vibrated with an incoming call from Ellie Donovan. Agent Hargrove nodded permission to answer. "Dr. Caldwell, you're currently trending on multiple platforms," Ellie stated without preamble. "Our stringer captured video of the FBI confiscating your historical agricultural documents. Care to comment on why federal agents are seizing medieval farming techniques?" Mason looked directly at Agent Hargrove as he responded. "We discovered manuscripts documenting sustainable farming methods developed in the 13th century that significantly outperform modern techniques. Somehow, the FBI believes these historical documents contain proprietary technology belonging to Meridian Agricultural Holdings. The same Meridian that spent $42 million lobbying against organic certification standards last year?" Ellie asked, the sound of rapid typing audible in the background. "The very same," Mason confirmed. "Their subsidiary was about to demolish the historic barn where these manuscripts were preserved for 8 centuries. Agent Hargrove signaled for him to end the call, which he reluctantly did after promising Ellie a full interview later. "That was unwise, Dr. Caldwell," Hargrove admonished. "Public statements could complicate our investigation." "Public visibility might be the only thing preventing these manuscripts from disappearing into corporate archives," Mason countered. "Historical knowledge of this significance belongs to humanity, not to shareholders." Before Hargrove could respond, Dr. Harrington's phone chimed with an incoming notification. He reviewed it with evident surprise. "Preliminary carbon dating results from the parchment samples," he announced. "The manuscripts date authentically to between 1210 and 1260 CE. No modern forgery." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. If the manuscripts were genuinely medieval, the case transformed from potential industrial espionage to something unprecedented. A corporation potentially attempting to patent centuries-old agricultural knowledge by disguising it as modern innovation. "This changes the investigative parameters," Agent Hargrove acknowledged, already formulating a new approach. "Dr. Caldwell, we'll need your expertise to properly contextualize these documents within medieval agricultural practices. I want your assurance that these techniques won't disappear from public knowledge," Mason insisted. "History suggests corporations have suppressed sustainable alternatives that threatened profitable chemical dependence in agriculture." The FBI doesn't take orders from corporations, Dr. Caldwell, Hargrove replied with evident pride. If Meridian has attempted to appropriate historical techniques as proprietary innovation that constitutes potential fraud against the Patent Office, a federal crime. As they discussed next steps, the conference room door opened again. A young agent leaned in to whisper urgently to Hargrove, whose expression tightened. "It seems your media contact works efficiently," she told Mason. "The National Science Monitor just published a breaking story titled FBI Seizes Revolutionary Medieval Farming Techniques Before Billion-Dollar Agricultural Corporation Can Bury Them." The article includes images of your greenhouse experiments showing dramatic growth acceleration. Mason's phone immediately began buzzing with notifications. Amy's screen similarly lit up with alerts and messages. What had begun as a local archaeological discovery was rapidly transforming into a national story at the intersection of history, corporate power, and sustainable agriculture. "You should know that Logan Walsh was caught on camera removing items from the barn after you were taken into custody," Hargrove informed them. "We've secured the entire site and are conducting a comprehensive archaeological assessment. If additional manuscripts exist, we'll find them. The techniques we've already documented could transform sustainable farming," Amy pointed out. "Higher yields without chemical dependence, reduced water usage, improved soil health, all using methods developed centuries before modern agribusiness," Dr. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. "Which explains both their historical significance and their modern commercial value. If these methods work, as your preliminary tests suggest, they could disrupt multi-billion-dollar markets for agricultural chemicals and genetically modified crops, making them a potential national security asset or a threat, depending on your perspective," Mason concluded, understanding now why federal authorities had responded so rapidly. The door opened once more, revealing a distinguished woman in her late 50s, whose bearing suggested significant authority. "I need the room," she announced simply, causing the federal agents to immediately comply. As the others filed out, she took a seat across from Mason and Amy. "Dr. Caldwell, Ms. Spencer, I'm Director Elizabeth Chambers, Agricultural Security Division. This conversation is now classified under national security protocols." She placed a tablet on the table, displaying images of Mason's greenhouse experiments, alongside chemical analysis of the medieval soil amendment formula. "We've been monitoring sustainable agriculture breakthroughs for decades," she explained. "What you've discovered represents a potential paradigm shift in food security approaches. Before this escalates further, you need to understand exactly what you're dealing with and why corporations like Meridian would go to extraordinary lengths to control these techniques." What Mason Caldwell couldn't know, as this national security official prepared to reveal the deeper significance of his discovery, was that the medieval manuscripts had triggered alerts in monitoring systems designed to track emerging threats to America's agricultural dominance. The ancient techniques preserved in that Vermont barn had become the center of a complex geopolitical calculation about food security, corporate power, and whether sustainable agricultural knowledge belonged to humanity or to whoever could secure legal ownership of it first. Director Elizabeth Chambers closed the conference room door with practiced efficiency, activating a small electronic device that emitted a faint hum, a security measure Mason recognized from his occasional work with university research laboratories. "Anti-surveillance protocol," Chambers confirmed, noting his awareness. "What we're discussing has implications beyond academic interest or corporate profit." She pulled up a series of classified documents on her tablet, turning it so Mason and Amy could see the screen. The first displayed satellite imagery of agricultural regions across multiple continents, with clear degradation patterns highlighted. "Global topsoil is disappearing at an alarming rate," Chambers began. Current industrial farming practices are depleting this essential resource 100 times faster than it can naturally regenerate. The USDA estimates we have fewer than 60 harvest cycles remaining before widespread agricultural system failure. Amy leaned forward, examining the data. These projections are more severe than publicly available models because they include classified climate disruption scenarios and proprietary corporate projections, Chambers confirmed. The agricultural industry is well aware of these timelines, but has prioritized quarterly profits over long-term sustainability. Companies like Meridian have contingency plans that focus on controlled scarcity rather than abundance, because scarcity is more profitable. She swiped to a new document, a federal assessment of strategic agricultural technologies with sustainability metrics for various approaches. At the top of the effectiveness rankings were methods labeled historical integration techniques that bore striking similarities to the medieval manuscripts. 5 years ago, a classified research initiative called Project Legacy began investigating pre-industrial farming techniques that maintained productivity for centuries without depleting soil, Chambers explained. The goal was to identify overlooked methods that could be integrated with modern approaches to create truly sustainable food systems. And you found them, Mason concluded, the pieces fitting together, but implementing them would disrupt the chemical-dependent model that generates billions in corporate profits. Chambers nodded. Historical research teams identified remarkable sustainability frameworks developed across multiple civilizations. The most promising discoveries came from medieval European agricultural guilds who created sophisticated organic systems that maintained soil fertility through centuries of continuous cultivation. She swiped to another document, a security assessment of agricultural technologies classified by national security impact. The methods described in Mason's manuscripts were categorized as Tier 1 strategic agricultural assets. Several major agricultural corporations have attempted to patent variations of these historical techniques over the past decade, Chambers continued. Our investigation suggests Meridian somehow gained access to transcribed portions of similar manuscripts through a university researcher who consulted on Project Legacy. They're trying to privatize centuries-old knowledge, Amy said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Knowledge that should be freely available to help address our environmental crisis. Precisely, Chambers confirmed. By claiming these methods as novel corporate innovations, they can control implementation through licensing and patent enforcement, transforming what should be universal heritage into proprietary technology. Mason leaned back, processing the implications. So when our discovery began generating attention, it triggered both corporate damage control and national security protocols, Chambers finished. What you found isn't just historically significant. It represents a potential paradigm shift in food security that various entities have powerful incentives to control or suppress. Where does that leave us? Amy asked. And the manuscripts? That depends partly on you, Chambers replied directly. Standard protocol would classify your discovery under national security restrictions, limiting public access while government researchers verify and develop applications. The manuscripts would remain in federal custody indefinitely. Mason shook his head emphatically. Unacceptable. These techniques were preserved for 8 centuries to benefit humanity, not to disappear into government archives or corporate patents. They represent solutions to problems we're facing right now. I understand your position, Dr. Caldwell, Chambers said, which is why I'm authorized to offer an alternative approach. Your foundation could partner with our agricultural security division to document, verify, and implement these techniques through a public-private initiative. The knowledge would remain accessible while receiving necessary protection from corporate appropriation. Before Mason could respond, his phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unknown number. Chambers nodded permission, clearly curious about the contact. "Dr. Caldwell," came a familiar voice when he answered. "Senator James Mitchell, Agriculture Committee. I understand you've made a discovery of potential national significance regarding sustainable farming practices." Mason glanced at Chambers, whose slight nod confirmed the legitimacy of the call. "That's correct, Senator. Medieval manuscripts documenting organic agricultural techniques that significantly outperform modern methods in preliminary tests. And I understand Meridian Agricultural Holdings attempted to claim these historical techniques as their proprietary innovation." The senator continued. "The situation is complex," Mason replied cautiously. "Federal authorities are currently investigating potential patent irregularities. Well, those federal authorities should know that my committee is announcing oversight hearings next week regarding corporate appropriation of historical agricultural knowledge," Senator Mitchell stated. "I'd like you to testify about your discovery and its implications for sustainable agriculture policy." Mason met Chambers' gaze as he responded. "I'd be honored to provide testimony, Senator, assuming the current security restrictions allow it." After ending the call, Chambers sighed. "Congressional involvement complicates our containment options. Mitchell has been advocating for sustainable agriculture reform for years. His committee will use your discovery to challenge corporate agricultural patents more broadly." "Good," Amy asserted. "These techniques shouldn't be locked behind patent walls or security classifications. They represent solutions developed by farmers centuries ago to ensure food security for their communities." The conference room door opened without warning as Agent Hargrove returned with urgent news. "Director, the barn site has been compromised. Walsh's team removed something before we secured the perimeter. Satellite imagery shows a vehicle departing for Meridian's research facility with unidentified materials." Chambers immediately gathered her documents. "Dr. Caldwell, the security situation has escalated. I need your expertise at the site immediately to assess what might have been taken." 20 minutes later, Mason stood in the partially demolished barn, now surrounded by federal agents conducting a meticulous archaeological assessment. The stone wall where they'd discovered the manuscripts had been further opened, revealing a larger cavity than originally documented. There was another compartment, Mason observed, examining the disturbed stonework. Professionally extracted, not damaged during removal. Whatever Walsh's team took, they knew exactly where to find it and how to retrieve it intact. Amy carefully photographed the empty space, measuring its dimensions. "Based on the cavity size and preservation methods we've already documented, this could have contained multiple bound volumes, possibly an entire compendium." Agent Hargrove approached with a finding from her team. Soil analysis detected residual materials consistent with oiled leather preservation techniques from the medieval period. Ground-penetrating radar indicates the wall contained multiple storage compartments in a deliberate arrangement. It wasn't random preservation, Mason realized. This was a systematically organized agricultural library, deliberately hidden for future discovery. The manuscripts we found might be just a fraction of what was preserved here. Dr. Harrington from the FBI Science Division joined them, examining soil samples collected from the site. Fascinating preservation method. The stonework was designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity levels while allowing minimal air circulation. Perfect conditions for long-term manuscript protection. As the federal team worked to document the compromised site, Mason noticed a small etching in the stonework that had been partially exposed during the extraction. Carefully brushing away centuries of accumulated grime, he revealed a distinctive symbol, 3 interlocking circles surrounding a stylized plant. "I've seen this before," he murmured, photographing the marking. "It appears in medieval records, of agricultural guilds, specifically a secretive organization called the Custodians of Abundance that operated throughout medieval Europe. Director Chambers examined the symbol with immediate interest. Project Legacy uncovered references to this guild. They were reportedly responsible for preserving agricultural knowledge during periods of political instability. Our researchers theorized they maintained hidden repositories of farming techniques throughout Europe, but we've never found physical evidence until now. Until Meridian found one, Amy corrected grimly. If they have additional manuscripts from this repository, they could patent components of an entire medieval agricultural system, piece by piece, Mason concluded, claiming each technique as a separate corporate innovation while hiding the historical source. Chambers immediately began issuing directives to her team, mobilizing resources to track the materials removed from the site. As federal agents established a secure perimeter around the barn, local news vans began arriving, drawn by reports of the unusual FBI presence at the historic property. What had begun as a routine archaeological documentation had now escalated into a complex federal case involving national security implications, corporate espionage, and potentially groundbreaking agricultural techniques that could transform global food production if they weren't locked away behind patent walls or security classifications. As Mason watched federal agents document every inch of the medieval barn, he couldn't help wondering what other knowledge might have been hidden by those ancient farmers, waiting centuries for rediscovery at a moment when humanity desperately needed sustainable alternatives to our failing agricultural systems. What Mason Caldwell couldn't know as he helped federal authorities assess the compromised archaeological site was that the ancient guild's preservation efforts extended far beyond this single Vermont location. The medieval agricultural network had created multiple repositories throughout the world, each containing complementary components of a sophisticated, sustainable farming system designed to endure through centuries of changing political and environmental conditions. Mason Caldwell stared at his cell phone in disbelief as the notification count surpassed anything he'd ever experienced. The kitchen table in his modest rental cabin had become an impromptu command center as he and Amy struggled to process the explosion of public interest in their discovery. "We're at 4.8 million views," Amy announced, monitoring Ellie Donovan's initial report titled, "FBI Seizes Revolutionary Medieval Farming Techniques That Could Transform Modern Agriculture." The journalist's skillful presentation had transformed their complex discovery into a compelling narrative that resonated across diverse audiences. CNN wants an interview, The Guardian is preparing a feature, and 3 major agricultural podcasts have requested appearances, Amy continued, scrolling through messages. The Senate Agriculture Committee just issued a formal invitation to testify next Tuesday. Mason rubbed his tired eyes, struggling to process how rapidly events were unfolding. Just 3 days ago, he had been a dedicated but obscure archaeological researcher trying to preserve historical farming knowledge. Now terms like agricultural whistleblower, medieval sustainability pioneer, and corporate patent challenger were being attached to his name across media platforms. Director Chambers called twice, Amy noted, reviewing missed notifications. The FBI has tracked the materials removed from the barn to Meridian's research facility in Burlington. They're preparing warrants to recover potentially stolen historical artifacts. Mason's phone rang, Senator Mitchell again, the 3rd call that morning. The influential legislator had positioned himself at the forefront of the emerging controversy, recognizing its potential to advance agricultural reform legislation that had previously stalled in committee. "Dr. Caldwell," Mitchell began without preamble when Mason answered, "I've just spoken with the Attorney General regarding your discovery. The Justice Department is preparing to intervene in Meridian's pending patent applications based on evidence that they attempted to claim historical techniques as proprietary innovations. They'll need your expertise to document the medieval origins of these methods. I'm happy to assist, Mason replied, but our priority remains protecting this knowledge for public benefit. These techniques shouldn't be classified, patented, or restricted. They represent solutions to critical sustainability challenges. Precisely why I've scheduled public hearings, Mitchell confirmed. The Agricultural Knowledge Heritage Protection Act, I've been advocating for 3 years, suddenly has bipartisan momentum. Your discovery provides the perfect case study for why historical agricultural innovations should remain in the public domain. After finishing the call, Mason turned to find Amy staring intently at her laptop. "You need to see this," she said, turning the screen toward him. "People are testing the basic techniques we described in Ellie's article." The screen showed dozens of social media videos from gardeners, small farmers, and agricultural students applying simplified versions of the soil amendment formula Mason had mentioned during his initial media appearances. In video after video, amateur experimenters documented remarkable growth acceleration and plant vigor using common ingredients assembled according to the medieval patterns. "They're replicating our results," Mason observed, both amazed and concerned by how quickly partial information had spread. But without the complete methodology, they're missing critical components of the system. That's not stopping them from sharing their findings, Amy noted. Hashtags like non-medieval growth and Caldwell method are trending globally. People are hungry for agricultural approaches that don't require corporate chemicals or proprietary seeds. Mason's contemplation was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Opening it revealed Ellie Donovan herself, accompanied by a production assistant carrying professional camera equipment. "Sorry for the unannounced visit," she apologized, "but we need to move quickly." Meridian just issued a press release claiming they've been researching historically inspired agricultural techniques for years as part of their sustainability initiative. They're positioning themselves as preservationists rather than appropriators. She handed Mason a tablet displaying Meridian's statement, which carefully reframed the controversy. "Our researchers have long recognized the value of historical farming knowledge. The techniques recently discovered in Vermont align with our ongoing research into sustainable alternatives, which we plan to make widely available through our licensed implementation program." They're getting ahead of the story, Mason realized, recasting their patent attempts as preservation efforts rather than appropriation. "Which is why we need your direct testimony immediately," Ellie pressed. "The public needs to understand what's really at stake. The difference between universal access to sustainable methods versus corporate-controlled implementation." Before Mason could respond, Amy's phone chimed with an incoming video call from Director Chambers. The Agricultural Security Division leader's expression conveyed immediate urgency. "Dr. Caldwell, we've identified digital intrusion attempts targeting your Foundation's research servers," she reported without preamble. "Sophisticated actors are attempting to access any documentation you may have stored regarding the manuscripts. I'm dispatching a cybersecurity team to establish secure communications." "We kept minimal digital records," Mason assured her. "Most of our documentation remains in physical form as a security precaution." "A wise decision," Chambers acknowledged. "Nevertheless, you should assume active surveillance of all electronic communications. We've confirmed that Meridian has engaged private intelligence contractors to track your activities and contacts." The situation was escalating beyond anything Mason had anticipated. What began as an archaeological discovery had transformed into an information security crisis, with powerful interests mobilizing to control, suppress, or exploit the medieval agricultural knowledge. And what's our best approach? Amy asked pragmatically, processing the intensifying circumstances. Maximum transparency, Mason decided. The more publicly documented these techniques become, the harder they'll be to contain or control. He turned to Ellie. We'll do the interview immediately, focusing on the core principles that anyone can implement without specialized equipment or proprietary inputs. As Ellie's team prepared the impromptu studio setup, Mason quickly assembled reference materials, photographs of the original manuscripts, data from their greenhouse trials, and historical context for the medieval agricultural guild that had preserved this knowledge through centuries. We should focus on the guild's preservation philosophy, he told Amy as they organized their presentation. The custodians of abundance deliberately created these repositories during a period of climate instability in medieval Europe. They weren't protecting this knowledge for profit. They were ensuring agricultural resilience for future generations facing environmental challenges. The parallels to contemporary climate disruption weren't lost on either of them. The medieval farmers had recognized the same fundamental truth that modern agriculture increasingly overlooked, that sustainable food production depends on regenerative practices that work with natural systems rather than depleting them for short-term yield increases. As Ellie's cameraman finished setting up, Mason received another call, this time from Dr. Rebecca Turner at the University Agricultural Department. Her normally measured academic tone carried unusual excitement. Mason, our expanded trials of your medieval formulations are showing extraordinary results across multiple crop varieties, she reported. The growth acceleration and drought resistance effects have been independently verified by 3 department research teams. The university is prepared to issue a formal scientific confirmation of your findings. That's excellent news, Mason replied, understanding the significance of institutional validation. Will the university claim any ownership, interest in these applications? That's why I'm calling personally, Turner explained. After considerable debate, the administration has decided to classify these techniques as discovered historical knowledge rather than novel innovation, placing them explicitly in the public domain. The political pressure following your media exposure factored significantly in this decision. This represented a crucial victory. Academic validation without proprietary claims would substantially strengthen the case for keeping these techniques freely available to farmers worldwide. As Mason ended the call, he noticed Amy engaged in an animated conversation with someone via video chat. A grey-haired man wearing traditional farming attire whose dignified bearing suggested considerable experience. Mason, you need to meet Frank Henderson, Amy called. Him over. He operates a 7th-generation organic farm in western Vermont. After seeing our story, he realized his family has been using similar techniques for centuries. The weathered farmer nodded respectfully. Dr. Caldwell, what you've discovered isn't entirely lost knowledge. Scattered elements have persisted in traditional farming communities passed down through generations. My grandfather called it the old way, techniques his ancestors brought from England in the 1760s. Can you document these methods? Mason asked, immediately recognizing the significance of living agricultural tradition connected to the medieval manuscripts. Been doing it my whole life, Henderson confirmed. Got journals going back to my great-grandfather describing soil preparations that sound mighty similar to what you found. Never knew they came from some special medieval guild, though. To us, it was just good farming. This revelation added another critical dimension to their discovery. The medieval techniques hadn't been entirely lost. Fragments had survived through traditional farming lineages, maintained by practitioners who recognized their effectiveness even without understanding their historical origins. Mr. Henderson, would you be willing to demonstrate these methods publicly? Ellie asked, recognizing the powerful narrative of continuous agricultural knowledge spanning centuries. Been showing neighbors for decades, the farmer replied with a modest shrug. Difference is, now people might actually listen instead of rushing off to buy the latest chemical fix. As they prepared for the interview that would broadcast these traditional methods to a global audience, Mason realized they had gained something perhaps more valuable than the manuscripts themselves: living practitioners who could demonstrate the practical implementation of these sustainable techniques. The knowledge preserved by the medieval guild had never been completely lost. It had persisted through unbroken chains of agricultural practice that corporate interests had systematically marginalized, but never completely erased. What Mason Caldwell couldn't fully appreciate, as he prepared to share this knowledge with the world, was how this combination of rediscovered manuscripts and living traditional practice was about to create a perfect storm of agricultural reawakening, one that would challenge the fundamental premises of industrial food production and the corporate control mechanisms that had come to dominate global farming. Mason Caldwell had never owned a formal suit until 4 days ago. Now, dressed in a hastily purchased navy ensemble that Amy had insisted was appropriate for the occasion, the archaeologist sat in the wood-paneled waiting room outside the Senate Agriculture Committee chambers. Through nearby windows, the Washington Monument stood tall against the morning sky, a surreal backdrop for a researcher who rarely traveled beyond New England's rural landscapes. 5 minutes, Dr. Caldwell, announced a committee aide, clipboard in hand. The senators are just finishing their preliminary statements, Mason nodded, tugging uncomfortably at his tie. Beside him, Amy reviewed their presentation materials one final time, having worked through the night to organize their evidence into the clear, concise format required for congressional testimony. Remember the core message, she whispered. This isn't just about historical preservation. It's about food security, environmental sustainability, and whether agricultural knowledge belongs to humanity or corporations. Never thought documenting an old barn would land me here, Mason muttered, still processing the whirlwind events of the past week. Those days had transformed everything. Ellie's initial report had now surpassed 12 million views. The university's confirmation of their findings had been covered by major scientific publications worldwide. Thousands of gardeners and farmers were already implementing simplified versions of the medieval techniques, sharing their results across social media platforms. Most significantly, the Justice Department had executed search warrants at 3 Meridian facilities, recovering materials removed from the barn, along with internal documents revealing the company's systematic efforts to appropriate historical agricultural methods through modern patent filings. Dr. Caldwell, they're ready for you now, the aide announced, holding open the heavy wooden door. Mason took a deep breath and entered the hearing room, immediately confronted by the intimidating semicircular dais where committee members sat. Facing him, behind them, a packed gallery of observers, media representatives, and industry stakeholders filled every available seat. Directly across from his witness table sat Meridian's executive team, including CEO Richard Blackwood. Their expressions conveyed a practiced corporate composure despite the intensifying scrutiny they faced. The committee recognizes Dr. Mason Caldwell, announced Senator Mitchell, the distinguished chairman, whose agricultural reform efforts had gained unprecedented momentum following Mason's discovery. Dr. Caldwell, you have 10 minutes for your opening statement before questions. As Mason approached the microphone, he momentarily froze. The banks of cameras and unfamiliar formality nearly overwhelmed his carefully prepared thoughts. Then, from the back of the room, he spotted a familiar face. Frank Henderson, the 7th generation Vermont farmer whose family had preserved fragments of the medieval techniques through centuries of continuous practice. Henderson's presence centered Mason, reminding him why this testimony mattered beyond academic interests or political maneuvering. "I'm not accustomed to speaking in settings like this," he began, his authentic voice carrying surprising authority. "In the formal chamber. 2 weeks ago, I was documenting a historic barn before its scheduled demolition. Today, I'm here because that routine survey revealed something extraordinary. An agricultural knowledge system developed in the 13th century that significantly outperforms many modern farming methods in sustainability, resilience, and productivity." Over the next 10 minutes, Mason methodically presented their discovery: the hidden manuscript repository, the sophisticated medieval agricultural guild that had preserved this knowledge, the remarkably effective techniques that integrated soil, biology, and plant relationships in ways industrial agriculture had systematically overlooked, and the preliminary research confirming their extraordinary effectiveness. "These methods aren't primitive historical curiosities," he explained, displaying graphs from the university trials. "They represent sophisticated ecological understanding developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Understanding we've largely abandoned in our rush toward chemical-dependent, extractive farming practices." Mason then addressed the central controversy directly. Meridian Agricultural Holdings has attempted to patent key components of this historical system by disguising medieval techniques as modern innovations. Their applications contain methods nearly identical to those documented in manuscripts carbon-dated to the 13th century. He displayed side-by-side comparisons of the medieval texts and Meridian's patent filings, the similarities unmistakable despite different terminology. "This isn't just academic plagiarism," Mason concluded. "It represents an attempt to privatize knowledge deliberately preserved for humanity's common benefit. The medieval guild that created these manuscripts didn't hide them to establish future profit streams. They preserved them to ensure agricultural resilience during periods of climate instability, exactly the challenge we face today." As Mason finished, the room remained momentarily silent before Senator Mitchell spoke. "Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. Your straightforward testimony helps frame the significant questions before this committee." He turned toward the Meridian representatives. "Perhaps Mr. Blackwood would like to respond to these allegations." Richard Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Agricultural Holdings, leaned into his microphone with practiced corporate poise. "While we respect Dr. Caldwell's archaeological expertise, Meridian categorically denies any improper appropriation of historical techniques. Our research division independently developed methods that may share superficial similarities with these medieval approaches through convergent innovation, a common phenomenon where different researchers reach similar solutions to universal agricultural challenges. Convergent innovation resulting in nearly identical methodologies, Mr. Blackwood," Senator Mitchell asked skeptically, "including specialized terminologies and preparation ratios." Before Blackwood could respond, Mitchell nodded to a staff member, who distributed folders to committee members. "The committee has received documentation from 6 former Meridian researchers detailing an explicit corporate strategy called Heritage Acquisition, designed to identify historical agricultural techniques with commercial potential and reframe them as proprietary innovations." Murmurs spread through the gallery as Blackwood consulted urgently with his legal team. Mason exchanged glances with Amy, realizing there were dimensions to this investigation extending far beyond their original discovery. Senator Mitchell continued, "Additionally, Justice Department investigators have provided preliminary findings, indicating that Meridian subsidiaries have filed 27 patent applications over the past 5 years, containing methods derived from historical farming practices without acknowledging their origins, a potential violation of patent office disclosure requirements. For the next 3 hours, the hearing unfolded like a meticulously constructed case, with committee members from both parties united in questioning Meridian's practices. Mason watched in astonishment as his archaeological discovery was repeatedly referenced as the catalyst that had finally exposed a systematic corporate strategy to monopolize agricultural knowledge through deceptive patent practices. During a brief recess, Director Chambers approached Mason in the hallway outside the hearing room. "Your testimony was excellent, Dr. Caldwell, clear, factual, and compelling." She hesitated before adding, "There's something else you should know. Our investigation has expanded beyond Meridian's patent applications. We've identified coordinated efforts by several major agricultural corporations to locate and secure historical farming knowledge worldwide. They're hunting for more repositories," Mason realized, the implications chilling. Chambers nodded. Satellite imagery shows increased corporate archaeological activity at medieval agricultural sites across Europe and Asia. They recognized the potential value of historical techniques before most academic institutions did. They just never intended this knowledge to become publicly accessible. "What about the additional manuscripts recovered from Meridian's facility?" Amy asked. "Being authenticated now," Chambers confirmed. "Preliminary assessment suggests they contain even more extensive documentation of sustainable farming systems, and potentially including pest management and seed preservation techniques that would further reduce dependence on commercial agricultural inputs." When the hearing resumed, Mason found himself answering increasingly detailed questions about the potential applications of the medieval techniques in contemporary farming contexts. Despite his limited agricultural expertise, his archaeological background enabled him to articulate the sophisticated ecological understanding embedded in these historical methods. "Dr. Caldwell," asked Senator Reynolds, representing a major agricultural state, "in your assessment, could these medieval techniques be implemented at commercial scale, or are they limited to small-scale or specialty farming operations?" "The fundamental principles are scalable," Mason replied after careful consideration. "The medieval system wasn't designed for massive single-crop operations, but its approach to soil health, water conservation, and natural pest management could transform our current industrial methods. Frank Henderson's family has applied similar techniques successfully on a 300-acre diversified farm for generations." He gestured toward the Vermont farmer in the gallery, whose presence embodied the living continuation of agricultural wisdom that corporations had attempted to claim as novel innovation. "The question isn't whether these methods can work at scale," Mason continued. "It's whether we're willing to reconsider our current approach to agriculture, shifting from extractive practices that deplete resources for short-term yield to regenerative systems that build capacity over time." As the hearing concluded, Senator Mitchell announced an unexpected initiative. "Based on evidence presented today, this committee is drafting the Agricultural Knowledge Heritage Protection Act to establish a new legal framework for historical farming techniques. These methods will be explicitly classified as public domain knowledge, preventing future attempts to restrict their implementation through patent enforcement." As Mason and Amy exited the hearing room, they were surrounded by journalists seeking additional comments. Among the press gathering, Mason noticed a distinguished woman patiently waiting at the periphery. When the initial questions subsided, she approached. "Dr. Caldwell, I'm Dr. Sophia Reyes, Director of the Global Seed Vault Initiative. Your discovery has profound implications for our preservation efforts. We'd like to establish a parallel project focused on documenting and preserving historical agricultural knowledge alongside genetic resources. Would you consider leading this initiative?" What Mason Caldwell couldn't know as he contemplated this unexpected opportunity was that his archaeological discovery had triggered a fundamental reassessment of what constitutes valuable agricultural heritage, expanding the concept beyond genetic resources to include the knowledge systems that enabled sustainable food production through centuries of environmental change. 8 weeks after his congressional testimony, Mason Caldwell stood in a field of experimental crops at the newly established Agricultural Heritage Research Center. The summer sun illuminated rows of thriving plants, cultivated using the rediscovered medieval techniques, their vibrant health evident even to untrained observers. The results from the third trial series confirm everything we've documented previously, reported Dr. Elaine Winters, the agricultural scientist who had joined the expanded research team. Growth rates averaging 62% higher than control groups, water requirements reduced by 41%, and pest resistance improved by approximately 70%, all without synthetic inputs. Mason nodded, still amazed by the consistent effectiveness of techniques developed centuries before modern agricultural science existed. What had begun as an archaeological curiosity had transformed into perhaps the most promising sustainable farming approach of the century. The soil microbiology analysis is equally impressive, Dr. Winters continued, referencing her tablet data. These medieval amendments create remarkably complex rhizosphere communities, beneficial fungi, bacteria, and microorganisms working synergistically with plant roots. Modern agriculture has systematically disrupted these relationships through excessive chemical applications. Across the experimental field, teams of researchers from 3 universities documented various implementations of the medieval techniques. The Agricultural Knowledge Heritage Protection Act, passed with unprecedented bipartisan support following Mason's testimony, had established this research center with dual mandates: preserving historical agricultural knowledge and developing practical applications for contemporary farming challenges. The international pilot programs are generating similarly promising results, Amy reported, joining them with fresh data from partner organizations. 17 countries have established implementation sites, adapting these methods to local conditions. The Ethiopian project is particularly noteworthy. They've achieved sustainable yields in areas previously considered marginally productive. Mason's phone chimed with a news alert. Supreme Court unanimously rejects Meridian's appeal. Medieval agricultural techniques confirmed as public domain knowledge. The final legal barrier to widespread implementation had fallen, despite Meridian's aggressive attempts to assert ownership over aspects of the historical system. Dr. Caldwell called a familiar voice. Frank Henderson approached across the field, accompanied by a group of farmers participating in the practical implementation program. The 7th-generation Vermont farmer had become an essential partner in the project, his family's lived experience with traditional methods providing crucial practical context for the archaeological discoveries. These folks just arrived from the Midwest training session, Henderson explained, introducing the visiting farmers. Conventional operations averaging 800 acres each, all looking to transition away from chemical dependency using these historical techniques. Mason greeted the farmers, struck by how dramatically the landscape had shifted in just 2 months. What began as historical documentation had sparked a rapidly expanding movement among farmers seeking sustainable alternatives to industrial agricultural practices. My operation has been locked in the chemical cycle for 3 generations, explained Sarah Jenkins, a corn and soybean farmer from Iowa. Each year requires more inputs for diminishing returns as soil health deteriorates. These medieval systems offer a viable exit strategy, rebuilding natural fertility instead of substituting synthetic versions. The farmer's practical concerns grounded Mason's work in immediate reality. These weren't academic researchers or environmental activists, but practical agricultural producers whose livelihoods depended on finding sustainable approaches that remained economically viable. Their interest confirmed the true value of what had been preserved in that Vermont barn, not just historical curiosities, but functional solutions to contemporary challenges. As they discussed implementation strategies, Mason noticed a government vehicle arriving at the research center. Director Chambers emerged, accompanied by officials he recognized from several federal agricultural agencies. "The Secretary of Agriculture is making an unscheduled visit," Chambers informed him quietly. "The success of these initial trials has generated significant attention within the administration. Policy frameworks are being developed to support farmers transitioning to these historical methods." The federal response had evolved dramatically from initial security concerns to active support. As evidence of the medieval technique's effectiveness accumulated, policymakers recognized their potential to address multiple interconnected challenges: food security, climate adaptation, water conservation, and rural economic sustainability. "Dr. Caldwell," Chambers continued, "the international dimensions of your discovery have expanded considerably. Satellite analysis has identified potential manuscript repository sites in France, Spain, and northern Italy, all with architectural features matching the Vermont barn's distinctive preservation chambers. The medieval guild established multiple knowledge caches," Mason concluded, a theory he had proposed based on historical records of the custodians of abundance, each potentially containing complementary components of their agricultural system. "Exactly," Chambers confirmed. "European archaeological authorities have secured these sites after corporate acquisition attempts were detected. Preliminary assessments suggest they contain additional manuscripts addressing aspects not covered in the Vermont documents, livestock integration, orchard management, and seed preservation techniques." What had begun as a single archaeological discovery was revealing itself as something far more comprehensive: a deliberately preserved agricultural knowledge system distributed across multiple locations to ensure its survival through centuries of political and environmental instability. As Mason prepared to greet the Secretary of Agriculture, Amy approached with her laptop displaying the latest development in their story's viral spread. "You need to see this," she said, showing him a crowdsourced implementation map where farmers worldwide were documenting their experiences applying the medieval techniques. The interactive visualization displayed thousands of implementation sites across 6 continents, with data voluntarily shared through a collaboration platform developed by Agricultural Extension Services. Each point represented farmers reclaiming historical knowledge that corporations had attempted to privatize through patent manipulation. "It's beyond anyone's ability to control now," Mason observed, recognizing the transformative scale of what was unfolding. "The knowledge is spreading organically through existing farmer networks, adapting to local conditions and challenges." This decentralized implementation represented the ultimate security for the rediscovered techniques. No corporate action or regulatory approach could contain agricultural methods being freely shared and implemented by thousands of independent producers worldwide. Later that afternoon, following productive discussions with federal officials, Mason walked the experimental fields with Frank Henderson. The experienced farmer's practical wisdom had proven invaluable in translating ancient manuscripts into contemporary applications. "My grandfather would have appreciated this validation," Henderson noted, examining a particularly vigorous section of crops. He faced ridicule for maintaining outdated methods when everyone else embraced chemical solutions. Turns out he was preserving something precious without even knowing its historical significance. "That's what fascinates me most about this discovery," Mason replied. "These techniques weren't completely lost. Fragments survived through practitioners like your family, who recognized their effectiveness through direct experience, even as institutional agriculture dismissed them as primitive or unscientific. Knowledge, stored in practice, not just documents, Henderson agreed. Though having the complete medieval system does add dimensions my family had lost over generations. As they discuss the integration of documented techniques with living agricultural tradition, Mason received an unexpected call from Dr. Sophia Reyes at the Global Seed Vault Initiative. Dr. Caldwell, our researchers have completed preliminary analysis of seed preservation techniques described in the manuscripts recovered from Meridian's facility, she reported with evident excitement. They describe methods for maintaining seed viability for extraordinarily extended periods, potentially centuries rather than decades, using entirely natural processes. That would transform seed banking approaches, Mason realized, understanding the implications for agricultural biodiversity preservation. Precisely, Dr. Reyes confirmed. Contemporary seed preservation relies heavily on technology-dependent methods, requiring consistent energy inputs and controlled environments. These medieval techniques offer complementary approaches using natural materials and processes that could function even during infrastructure disruptions. This revelation highlighted another dimension of the medieval guild's foresight. They hadn't simply preserved effective farming techniques. They had developed comprehensive, resilient systems designed to maintain agricultural continuity through extended periods of societal instability. As Mason ended the call, he noticed Dr. Winters signaling urgently from the laboratory building. Joining her inside, he found her examining newly processed pages from the manuscripts recovered during the Meridian facility search. We've translated the section on soil regeneration after catastrophic depletion, she explained, displaying the meticulously rendered medieval illustrations. It describes techniques specifically designed to restore agricultural viability in severely degraded landscapes, precisely the challenge facing many regions today after decades of extractive farming. What Mason Caldwell couldn't fully appreciate as he examined these ancient solutions to contemporary challenges was how completely his archaeological discovery was reconfiguring modern approaches to agricultural sustainability. The knowledge, preserved by medieval farmers, was proving remarkably suited to addressing the converging crises of soil degradation, climate instability, and resource depletion threatening global food security. 5 years after discovering the medieval manuscripts, in that crumbling Vermont barn, Mason Caldwell stood at the podium of the International Agricultural Sustainability Summit in Rome. Behind him, the digital display showed the extraordinary global impact of what had become known as the custodian methods, implementation sites across 143 countries, soil regeneration on 6 continents, and crop yields that had transformed food security prospects in previously vulnerable regions. None of us anticipated the scale of what would unfold when we documented those initial manuscripts, Mason acknowledged to the gathered delegates. What began as historical preservation revealed something far more significant: a sophisticated, ecological understanding developed through centuries of careful observation, preserved specifically for a future moment when humanity would need sustainable alternatives to failing agricultural systems. The summit represented the culmination of 5 remarkable years. The Agricultural Heritage Research Center had expanded into a global collaborative network linking farmers, researchers, and traditional knowledge holders. The techniques documented in the medieval manuscripts had been systematically implemented, verified, and adapted to diverse growing conditions worldwide. The most powerful aspect of this rediscovery isn't the specific techniques, remarkable as they are, Mason continued. It's the underlying philosophy they represent: an approach to agriculture that works in partnership with natural systems rather than attempting to overpower them through chemical force. As Mason surveyed the audience, he spotted familiar faces who had been integral to this journey. Amy Spencer, now directing the Global Agricultural Knowledge Preservation Initiative, Frank Henderson leading the Practical Implementation Network that had helped over 40,000 farmers transition to sustainable methods. Dr. Elaine Winters, whose research had documented the scientific mechanisms behind the medieval technique's extraordinary effectiveness. 5 years of field implementation have provided conclusive evidence, Mason explained, referencing the comprehensive data displayed behind him. Adopting these historical methods has increased average yields by 47% while reducing water requirements by 38% and eliminating dependence on synthetic inputs. Soil health metrics show consistent improvement rather than degradation, creating truly sustainable production systems. The statistics represented more than academic research outcomes. They translated directly into improved livelihoods for farming communities, enhanced food security for vulnerable populations, and regenerated landscapes previously considered lost to agricultural viability. Following his presentation, Mason joined a panel discussion featuring agricultural ministers from regions where the custodian methods had demonstrated particular impact. The Ethiopian representative described how adapted medieval techniques had transformed previously marginal lands into productive fields capable of supporting local communities through increasingly unpredictable rainfall patterns. What these historical methods offered was not just higher yields, the minister explained, but resilience, the capacity to maintain production through climate fluctuations that previously caused catastrophic crop failures. This represents true food sovereignty for communities long dependent on external assistance. The Indian Agricultural Secretary shared similar experiences, describing how regions suffering from decades of chemical-dependent farming had begun regenerating depleted soils using the medieval amendment formulas. Within 3 growing seasons, lands considered beyond recovery are demonstrating remarkable restoration of natural fertility. The economic impact for small farmers has been transformative. As the formal proceedings concluded, Mason met with Director Chambers, whose Agricultural Security Division had evolved significantly since their first encounter. Rather than focusing on containing agricultural knowledge as a national security asset, the division now worked to ensure equitable global access to sustainable farming techniques. The Meridian situation has been fully resolved, Chambers informed him. Their final patent appeals were rejected last month. More importantly, their corporate strategy has fundamentally shifted. They're now developing implementation tools and compatible technologies rather than attempting to control the underlying methods. This corporate adaptation represented perhaps the most surprising outcome of the past 5 years. After initial resistance, major agricultural companies had recognized that fighting the custodian methods was futile once they had spread through global farmer networks. Instead, many had pivoted to developing complementary products and services that worked within the sustainable framework, rather than attempting to replace it with proprietary alternatives. 7 additional manuscript repositories have been located and secured, Chambers continued. The complete medieval agricultural system has now been reconstructed, from soil preparation to seed preservation, livestock integration, natural pest management, and climate adaptation techniques. It's remarkable how comprehensive their knowledge truly was. The International Archaeological Initiative had revealed the impressive scope of the medieval guild's preservation efforts. The custodians of abundance had systematically documented and distributed agricultural knowledge across multiple secure locations during a period of climate instability in medieval Europe, creating a resilient strategy specifically designed to transcend centuries of potential disruption. They anticipated a future need for this knowledge, Mason noted, at a time when unsustainable practices might threaten food security globally. Their foresight was extraordinary. As evening approached, Mason joined a smaller gathering at a historic farm outside Rome, where the custodian methods were being implemented alongside traditional Italian agricultural practices. Under century-old olive trees, farmers from 6 continents shared experiences adapting the medieval techniques to their specific regional challenges. My family had abandoned our traditional fields after 3 consecutive drought years made conventional farming impossible, explained Maria Sanchez, a small-scale producer from southern Spain. Using these historical water conservation methods, we've brought that land back into production. The techniques feel both revolutionary and somehow deeply familiar, as though we're remembering knowledge our ancestors once held. This sentiment echoed across many participants. The medieval methods didn't represent alien approaches imposed on traditional farming communities. Rather, they often resonated with fragments of indigenous knowledge that had been marginalized by industrial agricultural expansion, but never completely forgotten. Frank Henderson, the Vermont farmer whose family had preserved components of these techniques through generations of practice, nodded in understanding. That's what strikes me most about this whole journey, he reflected. These methods weren't really discovered, they were remembered. They survived in scattered practices, family traditions, and indigenous knowledge systems that modern agriculture dismissed as unscientific or primitive. As twilight settled over the ancient farm, Mason found a quiet moment to reflect on the extraordinary path from that initial barn documentation to this global agricultural transformation. His phone chimed with a message from Amy. Satellite imagery confirming successful implementation of the custodian methods in a previously degraded region of the Sahel, with visible landscape regeneration extending beyond the cultivated fields. These tangible results represented the true validation of what had been preserved in that Vermont barn, not academic recognition or policy reform, but actual restoration of landscapes and communities through agricultural approaches that worked in partnership with natural systems rather than depleting them for short-term gain. What Mason Caldwell couldn't fully appreciate, even 5 years into this remarkable journey, was how completely the rediscovered medieval techniques had reconfigured humanity's relationship with food production. By demonstrating that truly sustainable agriculture wasn't a future aspiration requiring new technologies, but rather a recovered heritage of ecological wisdom developed through centuries of careful observation, the custodian methods had fundamentally shifted both practical implementation and philosophical approaches to feeding humanity. The medieval guild that had hidden those manuscripts during a period of climate instability had understood something that modern agricultural science was only beginning to rediscover: that the most sophisticated farming systems aren't those that dominate natural processes through chemical force, but those that harness the intricate ecological relationships that sustain healthy living systems. As Mason watched farmers from across the world sharing knowledge under those ancient olive trees, he recognized that the most significant outcome of their discovery wasn't measured in yields or economic metrics. It was the restoration of agricultural wisdom that connected people directly to the ecological systems that sustain them. Knowledge that had been systematically marginalized by industrial approaches but never entirely lost. The simple archaeological documentation that had begun in a crumbling Vermont barn had revealed not just effective farming techniques, but a fundamentally different way of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world, one based on partnership rather than extraction, on regeneration rather than depletion, and on knowledge freely shared rather than proprietarily controlled. In that sharing of wisdom across generations and cultures, Mason recognized the true legacy of the custodians of abundance, not just the techniques they preserved, but the understanding that agricultural knowledge belongs to humanity's common heritage, a birthright too precious to be locked behind patent walls or corporate ownership in times of global need. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.